So, welcome to the discussion portion of the IMF's Analytical Corner session on a fairer recovery, organized jointly with the Financial Times. I'm Colby Smith, a markets reporter at the FT, and I'm joined today by 6 IMF scholars who have done important work looking at the most pressing issues facing the global economy and some of the tools necessary to limit the extent of the damage caused by the coronavirus crisis. COVID-19 has created an enormous amount of personal hardship and one of the biggest and most abrupt economic shocks in history. Unemployment has skyrocketed, and an unprecedented number of businesses are struggling to navigate through this incredibly challenging period. Our focus today centers around how to achieve a more fair and inclusive recovery. These scholars have already put together insightful presentations on this topic, which can be found on the IMF's Analytical Corner landing page. Today, we'll dig even deeper into some of their findings and look at this issue from a variety of angles, ranging from social spending to addressing corruption. Bryn Battersby and Alif Ture of the Fiscal Affairs Department will tell us more about the enormous amount of government support that has been provided throughout this crisis. Anastasia Gushna and Atif Saeed Chaudhry will give us greater insight into how socioeconomic outcomes in the Middle East and Central Asia are changing and the importance of social spending. Next, we'll hear from Chanda Dalong of the legal department, who will sketch out in more detail the risks created by a potential wave of business insolvencies. And finally, Ivana Rossi, also of the legal department, will tackle the issue of corruption. So before I begin, I just want to say thank you to all of the participants here. I'm so excited that you all are joining me today and talking about this incredibly important topic. Bryn and Alif, we'll start with you. So in your presentation, you find that a whopping $12 trillion of government support has been extended across advanced and emerging economies so far. But beyond this aggregate size of support, which is enormous, your presentation also touches on some of the risks posed by poorly designed fiscal measures, which might create a situation in which firms in need are not getting sufficient support. And this issue seems the most acute with regards to small businesses who might perhaps not have equal access to capital markets as, let's say, large corporations to plug, large financing gaps. So, Alif, I'm wondering if governments are doing enough here to help small businesses, and what adjustments are necessary to ensure that policymakers have in place more comprehensive relief packages at this time.
Thank you, Colby, for organizing this. I must say that's a great question that emphasizes two of the key messages in our presentation. The first one is the heterogeneity of government support across countries. And the second one is the importance of careful assessment and disclosure of support measures, so that governments can tell whether the support is working, it is enough, or it's sustainable. So we see governments often announce a package of measures with a headline number. And breakdowns by beneficiary, like small businesses versus large firms, are usually not planned ahead or disclosed, even if they are planned. For instance, we were able to collect data on beneficiaries of government support only for some of the largest or more advanced economies. But I must say, the adequacy of support does not only depend on its announced size, but also on its take-up, which in turn depends on its proper design and implementation. And we should also think of public sector support to businesses in its entirety, because central banks also support the financial institutions like banks, which in turn are able to lend to businesses on favorable terms. So after this long introduction, all that being said, to answer your question, we see among the G20 countries, almost 15% of government support to date has targeted small businesses on average. So this is significant. And in some cases, like Japan or Switzerland, which is outside the G20 that we have data for, more than half of government support has been targeted at small businesses. And in these few cases, small businesses were able to access financing quite easily and in a timely manner. And we see that bankruptcies have been subdued, really. But this contrasts with limited support for firms in many lower income countries with tighter budget constraints or with larger informal sectors. These countries have often prioritized support the most vulnerable people or affected people, households. It's not only because of limited financing, but also because it's harder to reach small businesses that operate in informal sectors. So in short, what I'd like to say is that whether governments are doing enough to help small businesses is country specific. Yes, in some cases, and not so much in others. And I'd like to also add one more thing. Whether governments are doing enough to help small businesses, is country specific, but also the question is whether they can do better. Enough and better. Right? This requires continuous review and tailoring of support measures to the needs of small businesses. And as we mentioned in our presentation, in the United Kingdom, for instance, the take-up of small business loans were initially low because of, in a way, poor design. But after they tailored the loan terms, like the loan sizes and the component of government guarantees to the specific targeted small businesses, the take-up really skyrocketed. So to sum up, design really matters to ensure that support reaches and ultimately helps these businesses.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And your point about the fact that we need to differentiate between different countries, I think is incredibly relevant. And that brings me to my next question for Bryn here, because your presentation also highlights this vast divergence that has emerged between advanced and emerging economies, and just in terms of the scope and scale of the response to date. So I'm curious just if you could dive a little bit deeper, Bryn, perhaps into what some of the constraints facing emerging markets are at this time, and what kind of long-lasting damage perhaps you worry about given their limited capacity to forcefully respond to this crisis, perhaps much further than they have already.
Thanks, Colby, and thanks very much again, as Elif said, for doing this. It's really good to be here. Look, I think all governments are facing very significant challenges right now to protect lives and livelihoods, and emerging market economies are no different in that respect. For me, there are these kind of two main challenges that stick out. One is the financing challenge. Government revenues have been collapsing, and governments are under a lot of pressure to spend more, and in many cases the space to do that spending is tight. And the other is these implementation challenges, and so many countries are trying to implement often very large, exceptional measures, and they're trying to do it very quickly, and so there are some very big challenges in that type of implementation. Emerging economies, some of them are benefiting from historically low interest rates, and that's helping to lower the borrowing costs for some of them. But for many highly indebted emerging markets, fiscal space is really limited, and there's not a lot of capacity to borrow. And I'll just add, you asked about emerging markets, but I'll just add here that low-income countries are in an even tougher position with much more constrained fiscal space. Many of them already in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. So there are some tough choices that countries are having to make here in terms of the long run. Things around like long-term rises in unemployment. How do you deal with that? How do you face off increases in poverty and the potential for increases in inequality? And that's why implementation is going to be really important with these types of measures. And that's why we emphasised in our presentation that it's really important to carefully assess these measures and to carefully design them and make sure that they are targeting and benefiting the most effective and most vulnerable people in the countries. And we also really tried to emphasise how important it is to understand and manage the fiscal risks coming out of these measures and the fiscal risks that already exist. Because if these things are not done, if the measures are not designed carefully and the fiscal risks are not understood, poor execution could be really costly down the track. And that's the sort of thing we've seen in the past, where fiscal risks have created surprises that have made it very difficult in already limited fiscal space for countries to manage. I'll just add here that this is something that we've been doing a lot of work on. Indeed, I work in capacity development, and a lot of the work I've been doing has been helping countries to overcome some of these implementation challenges both around trying to understand and quantify the existing fiscal risks, and to map out what these measures should look like and how they can be implemented. And the reason, and again, getting back to the presentation, the reason that's so important is because, while poor design might be very costly down the track, if these measures are designed well, and if they're well managed and the fiscal risks are understood and quantified and disclosed, that can really help to strengthen the recovery and minimise the ultimate cost to taxpayers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this point on kind of specific implementation seems to kind of is relevant across all of these presentations. And just turning now to Anastasia and Atif here, I mean, your work specifically on social spending in the Middle East and Central Asia, I think it's incredibly important, this aspect of kind of the efficiency of some of this spending, just given some of the fiscal strains that we've already talked about kind of on a more broad basis at this point. So Atif, I wanted to follow up on this efficiency point, because I'm curious where you see the most room for improvement, and what governments need to do in your mind, and need to prioritize given some of the fiscal constraints that we know all too well some of these countries are facing.
This is a very pertinent question, because the countries in the Middle East and Central Asian region, they already have been spending a lot on other areas. They don't have fiscal space, and they have high levels of debt also. So increasing the efficiency of social spending becomes really important. Now, what factors determine the efficiency of social spending? Some factors are common across these countries. Governance is one of those. So improving the governance would not only help these countries identify the exact needs of these countries. On the other hand, control of corruption would also help increase the transparency of social spending. And hence, they would be able to avoid wasteful spending. And with smaller amount of spending, they would be able to increase better social outcomes. Rule of law also becomes really important, because this is also related to the governance issues. On better targeted social safety programs are also important in improving the efficiency of social spending. So once if the social protection programs are better targeted, then the money flows to the people who need it the most and who have the most to benefit in terms of social outcomes from spending that money. When we talk about the efficiency of social spending, financial inclusion also becomes critical in determining the efficiency of social spending. People who have access to financial services, they may be able to save their money for emergencies, and they may be also able to borrow money if they face any emergency. And instead of spending less on primary health care or taking their kids out of the school, they can borrow and spend on their emergencies. And they can also not forego on nutritious food intake. Expenditure on primary health care is also important. So if the expenditure on primary health care is not foregone and more spending is done on primary health care, then the problems, any health problems, are dipped in that stage. If they pass on to the chronic stage, then this becomes really expensive in subsidizing healthcare for such diseases. When we talk about the schooling, we have found that the efficiency of primary education is also very important. If the primary social spending on primary education is efficient, then the students are able to graduate into higher classes more efficiently, and hence they are able to get better outcomes out of the education spending. So these are some of the factors we found are important in helping these countries improve the efficiency of social spending. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. And technology obviously plays a critical role here, and that's something that your paper dives into as well. And so I wanted to ask Anastasia about, we saw in your paper that, certain countries have used technology, throughout this pandemic to ensure that the most vulnerable have access to critical resources. So I'm wondering if there are any technologies in particular that stood out to you as most relevant here, and if you view these changes as just perhaps temporary adaptations or perhaps, the beginning of more concrete change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Colby. We do note that technology matters in improving the efficiency of social spending even in normal times, because digital solutions allow you to more accurately identify the most needy people. You can create a database and you can cross-check the income position of various household members and make sure that it captures not only income but also their wealth and the size of the household, any kind of special needs that they might have. So this allows you to more better target your social spending and also avoid duplication of various programs, because these digital solutions having everything in one spot that various agencies could cross-check allow you to identify the most vulnerable and find the programs that are more likely to serve them in the long run. So digitalization is probably one way to boost efficiency even in normal times. Of course, COVID pandemic made it even more pertinent because as schools shut down, for example, it was not only the social protection that benefited from digital solutions, but it also ability of many governments to deliver educational services via remote schooling by mobile apps, using television, using radio, using computer. And if they had not done so, it would have been the poorest of the poor who would have fallen even farther behind in educational outcomes, because this is not a level playing field. The rich families can hire tutors to help their children access educational services and not to fall behind. But many countries, even countries that have very large refugee populations, such as Jordan, they were able to transmit lessons over radio, over television, and via mobile apps, so as not to leave the children behind. And that's key to more fairer recovery. Also, when it comes to health services, Atif mentioned that prevention is much better than mitigation. If you spend more at the primary level, like diagnostics and vaccinations and all those other services that you can provide, you can avoid a lot of chronic diseases and avoid emergency treatment that are much more expensive to subsidize. And ability of countries to find creative solutions during the pandemic, ability of doctors to provide remote services, consultations over Zoom and web access, that all helped serve the population. And even after this crisis is behind us, God willing, some of those digital solutions can also help, and hopefully the countries would continue to use them. And finally, in the delivery of social protection services, when money became the source of transmitting the virus, many countries went towards digital delivery, e-wallets, in sending the social protection payments to the population. Many of them allowed people to also open banking accounts by just using one button on the phone app. And that helps both in accessing financial services, which, as Atif mentioned, is key to efficiency of spending. And also it allows mitigate some of the direct corruption, because there is nobody standing between a poor person and this payment, asking for a bribe or a sidekick as far as delivery of this payment. So this kind of big leap that happened in the use of technology over the COVID crisis should hopefully continue even after it's behind us, both in social protection delivery, educational services delivery, and health services delivery. And that would make the spending more efficient and governments more accountable for the outcomes. Thank you.
Yeah, No, absolutely. Thank you. And just thinking about kind of the scope and scale of the government's response to date, it also, the flip side of that is some of the limitations that they face as well in terms of, what actually can be done just given the extent of this crisis in particular. So turning to you now, Chanda, because you focus on, insolvencies and the corporate sector. And clearly there are a lot of companies here that are finding themselves falling through the cracks of some of these aid programs or just unable to kind of weather this shock in any way, shape, or form. And you talk in your presentation about how mass business failures can create a situation where there is significant economic damage. But something that was very interesting that jumped out to me was this idea that still, there needed to be these quote unquote tough choices made when it comes to flattening the curve of insolvencies. So I wanted to ask you, where this whole situation does leave these smaller companies that perhaps, are less equipped than larger corporations to manage this process. And how do you kind of thread the needle between providing adequate support and assistance without overwhelming the court system?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think it gets to one of the big issues that countries are really facing, because we know that this crisis is affecting SMEs more than their larger corporates. And this is because of some pandemic kind of specifics and the response to the pandemic, but also because SMEs are just more vulnerable than their larger counterparts. So in terms of what policymakers can really do to support SMEs that are going through debt distress and need to restructure debts or maybe maybe their business operations, I'll talk here about I can think of really four key areas. I think first is that countries can actually develop out-of-court solutions specifically for small and medium-sized enterprises. So these out-of-court restructuring solutions, again, just outside part of the insolvency system, but outside of the in-court framework, countries can develop those frameworks specifically for SMEs. They can allow SMEs to restructure debt to maybe their large creditor or several of their creditors, including maybe even their public sector creditors. We saw this a lot in the context of the Euro area crisis, where countries did adopt these specific frameworks for these countries. I think second, which I also talk about in the presentation, is that countries can develop standardized solutions for SMEs. And this is because, one, business distress may be widespread, and two, because SMEs have relatively simple business models. So, for example, those SMEs that are considered viable, their going concern value exceeds their liquidation value, debts can be written down uniformly to a certain level. So we saw in Iceland, for example, debts were written down to the going concern value of firms. Third, the public sector is often an SME's largest creditor. So what the public sector can do is write off, take haircuts on tax claims, debts owed to Social Security administrations, maybe even greater than those owed to the private sector. And they can also facilitate new financing, providing low interest loans, loan guarantees. And the last point that I will make is that, when we talk about in-court insolvency frameworks, these are often designed for large corporates. They're procedurally kind of cumbersome, their costs are high. So countries can take steps to actually adopt or change their insolvency laws to have special procedures for SMEs. They can be more streamlined, costs can be lower, they can be more debtor-friendly. The United States did something earlier this year, and that could serve as a good example.
And just given that you just brought up the U.S., I am curious because the U.S. is clearly and has a court system that's quite advanced and has a solvency system that has fewer capacity constraints than, let's say, the likes of those in the emerging world. So how do your kind of recommendations and thoughts about what needs to be done change when you think about the different audiences, if you will?
Yes. So what my presentation talks about is one function of a modern insolvency regime. So modern insolvency regimes are able to, if they're effective, they're able to help businesses suffering debt distress to reorganize their operations, restructure their debts. And so maybe, 20, 30 years ago, this function of an insolvency law maybe was reserved for modern advanced economies, the US, the UK. In recent years, I would say that that's no longer the case. There are a number of large emerging market economies where an insolvency regime can effectively perform that function. China, India, Brazil, they come to mind. So the issues that I talk about in my presentation in terms of a system becoming overwhelmed, needing to take mechanisms to kind of flatten the curve so that the insolvency cases going into the system match core capacity, all those recommendations would apply to advanced and I would say emerging markets with higher capacity. Now, for lower capacity countries, so low income countries, maybe some emerging markets, their problem is not an overwhelm that the court system will be overwhelmed with insolvency filings. They will not need to flatten the curve. The problem may be entirely the opposite. There may be no cases going into the insolvency system, and instead businesses will just die. And so for those countries, they have their insolvency system is reserved for, to liquidate on a piecemeal basis companies that have already failed. And there's a lot of reasons that those systems are not up to their advanced or maybe larger emerging market counterparts. There's a lack of trust in the system. The court capacity is low, and importantly, there is very little credit. And new credit is necessary to restructure businesses. So for those countries that have low capacity in their system, I would say over the medium term, steps need to be taken to build access to credit and also build capacity of the court system, build capacity of judges, improve insolvency laws. On the shorter term, perhaps very simple, targeted, out of court restructuring mechanisms could be the focus for those countries.
Okay, got it. Well, thank you so much. And now I want to turn to the issue of corruption with our final presenter of the day, Ivana, because as all of these kind of presentations have already made kind of abundantly clear, is that governments around the world have stepped up to the plate in an unprecedented way, to limit the damage from the crisis. And we've heard a lot about these various reforms that need to be done, but what also needs to be front and center is how to ensure that public funds are used appropriately. So, Ivana, you've been working on this new measure to combat corruption. And in your presentation, you highlight the importance of increased transparency when it comes to government contracts and the people who benefit from them. And you bring up this point about beneficial ownership and understanding that whole dynamic better. So I'm curious what other applications beyond procurement you see as valuable here.
Thank you so much. I thank you so much for organizing this and for bringing up this question that gives me the opportunity to talk about beneficial ownership in a broader sense. Not only, this is such central information, and it's not only important for procurement, as you were saying, but for many other illicit flows purposes. So one of the things that I think it's important to always remember is that beneficial ownership is not a new concept. It's been around, the first definition that the anti-money laundering standard setter created was back in 2003. So this has been around for some time now. The issue is that for many, many years, this concept was only familiar to anti-money laundering or anti-corruption practitioners who would know very well which was the standard that you needed to apply for beneficial ownership for banks. But it was not really that well known outside of this. And the good thing is that this is now changing. The concept is really growing and it's becoming a lot more mainstream because its relevance, we keep really realizing its relevance because of the different ways in which companies can be misused. It's important to understand that when we talk about beneficial ownership, we're thinking about companies, we're talking about the corporate veil, and really not knowing who is the physical person that is behind a company that is benefiting from it, or that is controlling it, or that owns it through a chain of companies that will disguise the identity of this person. So, criminals are always criminals, big corrupt officials or criminals that have any other kind of activity are always trying to stay ahead of the curve. And this anonymity that companies can provide was really helping. But I think now that is really changing because we, in this presentation in particular, we were trying to uncover the potential misuse of companies for procurement, but the synergies of information are endless. For example, I always like to think of this example of how this information can use a lot of purposes at the same time, and you can start connecting the dots. For instance, imagine a world in which, you could have a public official that has done a financial disclosure, and in that financial disclosure, you can see that that public official has interests in certain companies. And then, because you also have information on the companies and the beneficial owners, you can join those dots and say, okay, but this company is also winning all of these procurement bids, and also this company owns a certain amount of apartments in New York or wherever you'd like. So I think that issue of starting to connect all of this information is what is really starting to change. And that world is happening now. We're doing those things, and measures such as the one I was describing in the presentation about promoting the transparency of who are the beneficial owners of the companies that are getting awarded public procurement contracts is one of these measures, but there are more. And these measures have two important consequences for this centrality of beneficial ownership. One is that it takes us a bit away from the technical aspect of the concept that can be a little bit complicated sometimes, and it brings it down to earth. It makes it a bit more tangible, and it represents it as a key aspect of that can be useful to confront a number of challenges. And so that's sort of the first item that we see with these type of measures. And then the second consequence that I see is that by revealing the potential benefits of using beneficial ownership information, we're also encouraging countries to come up with effective mechanisms to really identify beneficial owners. So, in practice, what is happening is that these measures are really improving the tools that we have available to go after those that have something to hide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, are you finding that the pandemic has either delayed or perhaps sped up the progress that countries are making when it comes to embracing these new reforms? I mean, should we view this period of time as, a moment of opportunity to kind of upgrade the system in a way?
Thank you for your question. I think on the issue of corruption, illicit forms, reforms, and if we're going faster or slower, I think the pandemic was a bit of a turning point. It was a big test that started to show how much progress there is. Let me illustrate this point. I've been doing this for many years, and for a long time, there was this common feeling that when you combat corruption or illicit flows, that you're always a few steps behind the criminals, because they're always finding new ways and more sophisticated schemes of sidestepping the anti-corruption controls or anti-money laundering controls. So there's also, that was on the one side, that feeling that was always there. And at the same time, there was this sort of misperception that grand corruption and illicit flows are a bit vague, not tangible for the regular citizen. This notion of the victimless, crime, particularly when we're dealing with large sums of funds at the transnational level. But, I think the pandemic really showed a shift on this. Don't get me wrong, we still have corruption and dirty money is still flowing. But I think most stakeholders that are in this fight are really catching up on that race against criminals. And I think there's 4 aspects to highlight that became very evident in the pandemic. One is, it's important to think of how quickly, civil society and investigative journalists started harvesting all of this data to uncover cases of, overpriced masks or supplies that never materialized, or, multi-million-dollar contracts that were given to friends or, connections or family. So that was one important aspect that came out. Then the second aspect is how people immediately understood in the pandemic that any public resources going into the wrong hands would directly impact them at the personal level. It would automatically be depriving people from medical supplies in the hospital if, they had to go. the third aspect was, how quickly also international actors such as the IMF, in this case, reacted and started including governance and anti-corruption safeguards for emergency funding, and also raising awareness about this issue of, we really need to minimize the misuse of public resources. And last but not least, the fourth point is, it's important to see how quickly also governments understood that they had to step up not only their social assistance and spending, but also their anti-corruption measures. Because in times of crisis like this, governments also recognize that scandals could lead to further distrust or inequality among the citizens. So I think these are the type of factors that, pushed us to innovate and promote this new take on transparency. And at the same time, it shows all of these new approaches of previously unexplored synergies that are now increasingly being used to combat corruption and illicit flows. And I think, for instance, the fact that 40 countries committed to this measure over the last 7 months shows that this crisis really worked as an accelerator of reform and progress in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating topic, and I wish we had more time to discuss that and all the rest of the presentations more. But unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I just want to say thank you to all of the participants. This has been an incredibly interesting discussion, and it's very clear that a lot has been done, but a lot more still needs to be done as well to ensure a more fair and inclusive recovery. So thank you all once again for joining me for this event. And just a reminder to our viewers that all of the presentations can be viewed in full on the IMF's Analytical Corner landing page. So thank you once again.